The dying embers of the campfire cast long shadows across Katherine Lawson's tear-streaked face as she clutched the tiny, still bundle to her chest. Arizona Territory, 1878, a place where hope came to die in the unforgiving desert heat, and tonight something far more precious had perished with it. "Eliza," she whispered, her voice cracking as she gently traced her daughter's peaceful face, still warm though the fever had claimed her just minutes before. "My sweet Eliza." Katherine had traveled west from Boston following her husband's death, carrying their unborn child and dreams of a new beginning. The small homestead she'd purchased sight unseen was meant to be their sanctuary. Instead, it had become a place of sorrow, miles from the nearest town, with only the whistling wind to hear her grief. She hadn't noticed the approaching horse until it was nearly upon her small cabin. Katherine looked up, startled, one hand instinctively shielding her daughter's face from view, the other reaching for the rifle propped beside her rocking chair on the porch. The rider dismounted with fluid grace that belied his exhaustion. Tall and broad-shouldered, he removed his hat to reveal sun-streaked hair and a face weathered by years under the harsh western sky. His eyes, though, were kind, impossibly blue, and filled with immediate concern as he took in the scene before him. "Madam," he said softly, keeping his distance, "I don't mean to intrude. Name's Yates Zachary. My horse picked up a stone a mile back, and I noticed your light." Katherine didn't answer, her body curling protectively around her daughter's. The stranger's gaze fell to the bundle in her arms, understanding dawning in his expression. "Your child," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "The fever took her," Katherine managed, the words tearing from her throat. "An hour ago, she fought for 3 days. Yates Zachary removed his hat, pressing it against his chest. He stood absolutely still for a long moment, then asked, "Is there someone I can fetch for you, madam? Family nearby?" Katherine shook her head. "There's no one. Just us." Her voice broke on the last word, the reality of her solitude crashing down upon her. The cowboy shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to leave a grieving mother alone in the wilderness. "If you'll permit me, madam, I'll just sit over here a spell. Sometimes it helps not to be alone, even with a stranger." Without waiting for her response, he settled himself on the far end of the porch steps, resting his back against the railing, giving her both company and distance. Katherine was too exhausted, too shattered to object. The night stretched before her, endless and unbearable. She was 6 months old, Katherine found herself saying as the night deepened around them. Her name was Eliza, after my mother. "That's a fine name," Yates replied softly. "A dignified name." They fell silent again, but somehow his presence made the weight on her chest fractionally lighter. The stars wheeled overhead, countless and cold, as Katherine rocked her baby for the last time. The cowboy remained, quiet and steady, his gaze respectfully averted, but his presence unwavering. As the eastern sky began to pale with the first hint of dawn, Katherine realized she'd been talking for hours, telling this stranger about Eliza's birth, her first smile, the way she would grip Katherine's finger with surprising strength. Yates had listened, offering nothing but his attention and occasional murmurs of understanding. The rising sun painted the horizon in shades of pink and gold. Katherine looked down at her daughter's face, beautiful and peaceful in the new light. "I need to bury her," she whispered. Yates stood, dusting off his trousers. "If you'll allow me, madam, I can help with that." She nodded, unable to form words. With gentle reverence, he asked where she'd like the grave to be. and Katherine pointed to a spot beneath the cottonwood tree behind the cabin, the only shade for miles, where wildflowers somehow managed to bloom despite the harsh conditions. While Katherine wrapped Eliza in her christening blanket, Yates dug the small grave. His strong hands worked steadily, his back bent to the solemn task. When it was time, he stood apart as Katherine placed her daughter in the earth, murmuring prayers her own mother had taught her long ago. When she finally stepped back, Yates approached with his hat in his hands. "Would you like me to say something, madam? I'm no preacher, but—" "Please," Katherine interrupted, desperate for any words that might make sense of this senseless loss. The cowboy cleared his throat, his deep voice carrying across the silent morning. "Lord, we commit this little lamb to your keeping. Eliza Lawson, too brief a visitor to this hard world, but surely welcomed into a better one. Watch over her mother, who loved her well and true. Amen." "Amen," Katherine echoed, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. She swayed, and Yates was beside her instantly, his arms strong around her shoulders. "Let's get you inside, Mrs. Lawson. You need to rest." Katherine allowed herself to be guided into the cabin, too numb to protest. The small home that had echoed with Eliza's cries now felt cavernous in its silence. She collapsed onto the narrow bed, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. "I'll be on the porch if you need anything," Yates said, turning to leave. "Why?" Katherine asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Why would you stay?" He paused at the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light. "Because no one should be alone on the hardest day of their life." She woke hours later to the smell of coffee and the sound of quiet movement in her small kitchen. For one disoriented moment, Katherine reached instinctively for Eliza's cradle beside the bed before the crushing reality returned. A strangled sob escaped her before she could suppress it. Yates appeared in the doorway, a steaming cup in his hand. "I hope you don't mind, madam. Found some coffee in your stores. Thought you might need it." Katherine sat up, pushing her tangled hair from her face. She accepted the cup with trembling hands. "Thank you, Mr. Zachary." "Yates, please." She nodded, sipping the strong brew. It was better than what she usually made. "You're still here." "Said I would be." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "I've taken the liberty of tending to your animals. Hope that wasn't overstepping." "No, it's—" She trailed off, unsure how to express her gratitude for such simple kindness. "Thank you." He nodded, then gestured to the door. "Made some beans too, if you feel up to eating." Katherine couldn't imagine ever wanting food again, but she followed him to the kitchen where he'd prepared a simple meal. They ate in silence, the reality of her loss hanging between them. When she pushed away her half-finished plate, Yates didn't comment. "Do you have family somewhere who could come?" he asked finally. "Anyone I could ride to fetch?" Katherine shook her head. "My parents are gone. My husband died last year in Boston. That's why I came west to start fresh." Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It's a hard country to start fresh in alone." "I'm learning that," she replied bitterly, then immediately regretted her tone. "I'm sorry. You've been nothing but kind." "No apologies needed, Mrs. Lawson. Not today." "Katherine," she corrected softly. "If I'm to call you Yates." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Katherine, then." Later, when he announced he should be moving on, Katherine felt a surge of panic she couldn't explain. This stranger had been her only anchor in a storm of grief, and the thought of facing the empty cabin alone was suddenly unbearable. "There's a creek needs damming on the north side of your property," he said, as if making casual observation. "Your garden could use some attention, too. If you're willing, I could stay a few days, help get things in order before I continue on." Relief flooded her, though pride made her ask, "Don't you have somewhere to be?" Yates shrugged, his eyes honest. "Nowhere that can't wait." That night, he slept in the barn despite Katherine's offer of the small sofa in the cabin. The next morning, she found him already at work, his sleeves rolled up as he repaired the loose boards on her porch. He worked steadily through the day, stopping only when Katherine called him for the simple meal she'd prepared. One day stretched into 3, then a week. They fell into an unexpected rhythm, Yates working outside from dawn to dusk, Katherine slowly returning to her household tasks. They spoke little, but the silence was companionable rather than strained. Each evening before retiring to the barn, Yates would join her on the porch. Sometimes they talked. He told her about growing up in Texas, about the cattle drives he'd worked, the places he'd seen. Katherine shared stories of her life in Boston, of meeting her husband Thomas at a literary society, of their dreams of adventure that had seemed so romantic from the safety of civilization. Other times they simply sat in silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. Katherine found herself looking forward to these quiet moments, even as guilt gnawed at her for finding any comfort so soon after Eliza's death. On the 10th day, she finally asked the question that had been hovering between them. "Where were you headed when you stopped here?" Yates leaned back in his chair, considering. "Nowhere specific. Just moving on like I've done most of my life." "From what?" His eyes met hers, something unreadable in their depths. "Some ghosts, mistakes. The usual." Katherine nodded, understanding the desire to outrun one's past. Hadn't she done the same, fleeing Boston after Thomas's death, determined to build something new from the ashes of her old life? "Your husband," Yates said carefully. "You don't speak much of him." Katherine stiffened, then consciously relaxed her shoulders. "Thomas was brilliant, a professor at the university. Everyone said we were a perfect match, both educated, from good families. But, Yates prompted when she fell silent. "But I'm not certain we were in love, not really." The admission felt both traitorous and freeing. "We respected each other, enjoyed each other's company. When he died of pneumonia, I mourned him genuinely. Yet it wasn't the kind of love that breaks you apart," Yates finished softly. Katherine nodded, tears threatening. "But Eliza, losing her has shattered something in me I fear will never heal." Yates reached across the space between their chairs, his calloused hand covering hers briefly. "It will heal," he said quietly. "Differently than before. But it will." The unexpected touch sent warmth spiraling through Katherine's cold grief. She withdrew her hand, suddenly conscious of how improper this situation might appear to others, a widow alone with a strange man, sharing confidences under the desert stars. "I should turn in," she said, rising abruptly. "Good night, Yates." If he was hurt by her sudden withdrawal, he didn't show it. "Good night, Katherine." The next morning, she woke to find him loading his saddlebags onto his horse. "You're leaving," she said, unable to mask her disappointment. Yates turned, his expression somber. "I've stayed longer than I intended. Your place is in good repair now." Katherine wanted to protest, to ask him to stay, but pride held her tongue. What right did she have to delay this man who had already given her so much of his time? Besides, What would people think if he remained? Of course, she said stiffly. I'm grateful for your help. Yates studied her face, then nodded once. He mounted his horse with practiced ease, settling into the saddle before looking down at her. If you ever need anything, the Simpson Ranch is 20 miles east. They know me there. You can leave word. Katherine nodded, her throat too tight for words. She watched as he turned his horse, tipping his hat to her one final time before riding away. Only when he was a distant speck on the horizon did she allow the tears to fall. The silence of the homestead pressed in around her once more. Katherine moved through her days mechanically, tending the garden Yates had expanded, caring for the chickens and the milk cow, reading the few books she'd brought from Boston. Each night, she sat alone on the porch, staring at the stars and wondering where Yates Zachary might be sleeping under the same vast sky. She visited Eliza's grave each morning, speaking softly to her daughter about mundane things, the weather, the vegetables sprouting in the garden, the antics of the barn cats. Sometimes she would mention Yates, telling Eliza about the kind cowboy who had sat vigil with them through the darkest night. 2 weeks after his departure, Katherine was startled by the sound of approaching horses. Heart racing, she grabbed her rifle and stepped cautiously onto the porch, shielding her eyes against the setting sun. 3 riders approached 2 men and a woman, all dressed in the practical clothes of ranchers rather than the rough garb of outlaws. Katherine lowered her rifle slightly but kept it ready as they drew up to her yard. "Mrs. Lawson," called the oldest of the men, a weather-beaten rancher with silver threading his dark beard. "I'm Harold Simpson. This is my wife Eleanor and our foreman, Jim Cooper." "The Simpsons," Katherine echoed, realization dawning. "From the ranch 20 miles east." Eleanor Simpson, a handsome woman in her 50s, smiled warmly. "Yates told us about your situation. We would have come sooner, but we've been rounding up strays from the spring storms." "Yates sent you?" Katherine asked, her heart skipping oddly. "Said you were out here all alone," Harold confirmed. "Not right for a woman to be so isolated, especially after—" He trailed off tactfully. "We brought some supplies," Eleanor added, dismounting with her husband's help. "And I thought perhaps you might appreciate some female company, even briefly." Touched by their kindness, Katherine invited them inside. While the men unloaded the provisions they'd brought, flour, sugar, coffee, cured meats, and even a small bag of hard candies, Eleanor sat with Katherine at her small table. "Yates Zachary isn't one to involve himself in others' affairs," Eleanor said thoughtfully, watching Katherine's face. "He's been riding through these parts for years, never staying anywhere long. For him to be concerned enough about you to ask us to check in, well, it's unusual." Katherine busied herself with the coffee pot, hoping to hide the flush creeping up her neck. "He was very kind during a difficult time. I'm grateful to him and to you for coming." Eleanor's shrewd eyes softened with understanding. "Grief is a lonely journey, even when surrounded by others, but it needn't be solitary all the way through." "I'm managing," Katherine said, more sharply than she intended. "Of course you are," Eleanor replied evenly, "but there's no shame in accepting help, especially here. The West isn't forgiving of prideful independence." Before leaving, the Simpsons extended an invitation for Katherine to attend the upcoming harvest dance at their ranch. "The whole territory comes," Harold explained. "Good way to meet your neighbors, make some connections." "I'm in mourning," Katherine protested weakly. Eleanor patted her hand. "Life continues, dear, especially here. Think about it. We'd be pleased to have you." After they departed, Katherine found herself considering the invitation more seriously than she'd expected. The prospect of seeing other people of music and conversation was surprisingly appealing after weeks of solitude broken only by grief. The night of the dance arrived clear and warm, with a full moon illuminating the desert. Katherine, dressed in her best dress, a deep blue that had been considered too vibrant for proper mourning in Boston, but was the finest she owned. She pinned her hair up, studying her reflection in the small mirror with critical eyes. Grief had hollowed her cheeks, but there was color there now that hadn't been present in the days after Eliza's death. She almost changed her mind a dozen times on the long ride to the Simpson ranch, but the sound of music and laughter drawing closer eventually quieted her doubts. The ranch house and barn were festooned with lanterns, casting a golden glow over the gathering. Katherine had never seen so many people in one place since leaving Boston families with children, young couples, grizzled old-timers, ranch hands, and even a few elegantly dressed gamblers from the nearest town. Eleanor spotted her immediately, hurrying over to welcome her and introduce her to a dizzying array of neighbors. Katherine smiled and nodded, overwhelmed by the sudden socialization after so much isolation. She was grateful when Harold offered her a glass of punch and a seat near the edge of the festivities, where she could observe without being constantly engaged. It was there, watching the dancers whirl to the lively fiddle music, that she first caught sight of him. Yates stood across the barn, deep in conversation with Jim Cooper. He was clean-shaven, his hair trimmed, wearing a dark shirt and vest that transformed him from the rough cowboy she'd known into something altogether more striking. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his eyes finding hers instantly across the crowded room. For a moment, neither moved. Then Yates excused himself from Jim and made his way toward her, weaving through the dancers with easy grace. "Katherine," he said, stopping before her, "I hadn't expected to see you here." "The Simpsons were very persuasive," she replied, her heart beating unnaturally fast. "I didn't know you would be attending either." A small smile touched his lips. "Harold's an old friend. I try to make it back for his gatherings when I can." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unasked questions. "How have you been?" he finally asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Katherine considered her answer carefully. "Some days are easier than others, but I'm continuing." Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's all any of us can do." The music changed to something slower, and Yates glanced toward the dancers before returning his gaze to her. "Would you care to dance, Katherine? Only if you feel ready, of course." She should refuse. It was too soon after Eliza's death for such frivolity. What would people think? But the truth was, she wanted to feel something other than grief, if only for a moment. "Yes," she said simply, placing her hand in his outstretched one. Yates led her to the edge of the dancing area, one hand resting lightly at her waist, the other holding hers with surprising gentleness. They moved together easily, as if they'd danced 100 times before. Katherine was acutely aware of his nearness, of the strength in the arm that guided her, of the faint scent of soap and leather that seemed uniquely his. "You're a good dancer," she observed, trying to break the tension humming between them. "My mother insisted all her sons learn," he replied, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Said no son of hers would stomp around a dance floor like an untrained horse." The image made Katherine smile, perhaps her first genuine smile since Eliza's death. "She sounds formidable." She was, Yates agreed, a shadow crossing his face. Died when I was 16. Fever took her in less than a week. Understanding bloomed between them. This was why he had stopped that night, why he had stayed with the stranger in her grief. He knew the particular agony of watching illness claim a loved one. "I'm sorry," Katherine said softly. Yates nodded, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "It changes you, that kind of loss. Makes you see things differently." The music ended, but they remained still for a moment longer, connected by something deeper than the dance. Eventually, Yates stepped back, releasing her with obvious reluctance. "Would you like to get some air?" he asked. Katherine nodded, following him through the crowd and out onto the wide ranch porch. The night air was cool after the warmth of the barn, and she wrapped her arms around herself against the slight chill. Without a word, Yates removed his jacket and placed it gently around her shoulders. The weight of it, still warm from his body, enveloped her like an embrace. "Thank you," she murmured, both for the jacket and for understanding her need to escape the noise and closeness of the dance. They stood side by side, looking out at the moonlit landscape. In the distance, coyotes called to one another, their eerie songs floating across the desert. "Will you be staying in the territory?" Katherine asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Yates considered the question. "I've been thinking about it. Simpson offered me work managing his northern pastures. It would mean settling in one place for a while." "That's not something you usually do?" He shook his head. "Not since I was young. After my mother died, home didn't feel like home anymore. I've been drifting ever since." "And now?" Katherine asked, her voice barely audible. Yates turned to face her, his expression serious in the silvery moonlight. "Now I'm wondering if maybe it's time to stop running. If maybe there are reasons to stay in one place." The implication hung between them, too new and fragile to acknowledge directly. Katherine looked away, suddenly overwhelmed by the possibilities his words suggested. "It's too soon," she said, not sure if she was speaking to him or herself. "Eliza's only been gone a month. I can't. I shouldn't." "I know," Yates said gently. "I'm not asking for anything, Katherine. Just telling you where my thoughts have been." She nodded, grateful for his understanding. "I should return to the homestead. It's a long ride back." "Let me escort you," he offered immediately. These trails can be tricky in the dark, even with the full moon. Katherine wanted to refuse, to prove her independence, but practicality won out. "Thank you. That would be wise." They made their goodbyes to the Simpsons, Eleanor embracing Katherine warmly and extracting a promise that she would visit again soon. As they rode away from the ranch, the music and laughter faded behind them, replaced by the night sounds of the desert. They traveled mostly in silence, Yates occasionally pointing out landmarks or warning of rough terrain ahead. Katherine was grateful for his quiet company, for the absence of pressure to fill the space between them with words. When they reached her homestead, Yates dismounted to help her down from her horse, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a brief moment after her feet touched the ground, they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool night air. "Thank you for the escort," she said, stepping back. "My pleasure." Yates hesitated, then added, "I'll be working at the Simpson Ranch for at least the next few months, if you ever need anything." "I'll send word," Katherine promised. He nodded, satisfaction in his expression. "Good night then, Katherine." "Good night, Yates." She watched him ride away, his figure gradually swallowed by the darkness. Inside her cabin, She removed his jacket from her shoulders, realizing too late that she'd forgotten to return it. The garment still carried his scent, and Katherine found herself holding it close for a moment before carefully hanging it beside the door. The weeks that followed settled into a new pattern. Katherine continued her solitary existence at the homestead, but now with regular visits from Eleanor Simpson, who brought news, supplies, and most importantly, friendship. Occasionally, Harold or Jim would ride by to help with more difficult tasks around the property. Of Yates, she saw little, though Eleanor mentioned him often enough that Katherine knew he remained at the Simpson ranch, working long hours with the cattle in the northern pastures. Sometimes in the evenings, Katherine would sit on her porch and imagine she could see the distant lights of campfires where the cowboys watched over their herds. Summer turned to fall, bringing cooler temperatures and spectacular sunsets that painted the desert in shades of orange and purple. Katherine found herself thinking of Boston less and less, the memories of her life there fading like an old photograph left in the sun. One crisp October morning, she was surprised by the sound of a wagon approaching. Wiping her hands on her apron, Katherine stepped outside to find Yates pulling up to her cabin, a loaded wagon behind him. "Morning," he called, setting the brake and jumping down with easy grace. "This is unexpected," Katherine replied, unable to hide her pleasure at seeing him. Yates removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she remembered well. "Harold mentioned you were planning to lay in supplies for winter. Thought I'd offer to take you into town, safer than making the trip alone." Katherine hesitated. She'd been avoiding the small town 30 miles away, unwilling to face strangers or their inevitable questions. But winter would arrive soon, and her provisions were running low. "That's very thoughtful," she said finally. "I would appreciate the company." While Katherine gathered her list and funds, Yates waited patiently outside. The ride to town passed quickly, filled with comfortable conversation about the changing seasons, the progress of her garden, and news of the territory that Yates had picked up in his travels. The town of Copper Springs was smaller than Katherine had imagined. A single dusty street lined with essential businesses, general store, saloon, blacksmith, small hotel, and a church still under construction. Curious eyes followed them as Yates helped Katherine down from the wagon, but he stayed close beside her, his presence both protective and reassuring. In the general store, the proprietor's wife, Mrs. Jenkins, proved to be a fountain of information and gossip, chattering as she helped Katherine select fabrics, medicines, and preserved foods. "You must be the widow from out by Cottonwood Creek," she said, eyeing Katherine with frank curiosity. "The Simpsons mentioned you. All alone out there with a baby," they said, "though I see no child with you today." Katherine froze, the pain of Eliza's loss suddenly fresh again. Before she could respond, Yates stepped forward, his voice firm but polite. "Mrs. Lawson lost her daughter to fever this past summer," he said quietly. "I'm sure you understand it's still a tender subject." Mrs. Jenkins had the grace to look abashed. "Oh, my dear, I am sorry. How thoughtless of me. Of course." She bustled away to fetch more items, leaving Katherine staring at Yates with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, his eyes full of understanding. People don't always think before they speak. As they continued their shopping, Katherine became aware of the speculative glances being cast their way, a handsome cowboy and a young widow, clearly comfortable in each other's company. By the time they finished loading the wagon with supplies, she could practically feel the weight of the town's curiosity. "They're going to talk," she said as they left Copper Springs behind. Yates shrugged, unconcerned. People always talk. It's what they do when there's nothing more interesting happening. Doesn't it bother you? What they might say about us? He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. Does it bother you? Katherine considered the question honestly. In Boston, such gossip would have mortified her. Here, somehow, it seemed less important. I suppose not, she admitted finally. Not as much as it once would have. Yates smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. The West changes people that way. Makes you realize what matters and what doesn't. When they reached her homestead, Yates insisted on helping her unload and store the supplies. The simple domestic task took on a different quality with him there, his strength making quick work of what would have taken Katherine hours alone. As the sun began to set, she invited him to stay for supper, a small repayment for his help throughout the day. They worked together in her tiny kitchen, moving around each other with an ease that felt strangely familiar, as if they had done this 100 times before. Over the simple meal of beef stew and biscuits, their conversation deepened. Katherine found herself telling Yates about her childhood dreams, her love of books, her secret desire to write stories of her own someday. In turn, he spoke of his brothers scattered across Texas, of the beauty he'd found in the most desolate places, of his hope to someday have land of his own. Not a big spread, he clarified, helping himself to a second serving of stew. Just enough for a small herd, a good garden, somewhere peaceful. Like this place, Katherine suggested. Yates looked around the cabin, his gaze warm. Something like this would suit me fine, with a few additions, of course. Such as? A bigger barn, more grazing land. He hesitated, then added quietly, a family to share it with. The air between them changed, charged with possibility. Katherine busied herself with clearing the dishes, her hands less steady than she would have liked. It's getting late, she said finally. You should start back before it's fully dark. Disappointment flickered across Yates's face, but he nodded, rising from his chair. You're right. Thank you for the meal. At the door, he paused, turning back to face her. Katherine, I've been thinking. Winter's coming on fast. These homesteads get isolated when the snow flies. I'd feel better knowing you had someone checking on you regular like. Are you offering? She asked, her voice softer than intended. If you'd allow it, he replied, matching her tone. Katherine knew she should refuse. A single woman accepting regular visits from a man it wasn't proper, even by the looser standards of the territory. Yet the thought of the long winter months stretching before her, with only occasional visits from the Simpsons, made the prospect of Yates's company all the more appealing. I would welcome your visits, she said finally, as a friend. Something like hope flared in his eyes, quickly tempered with respect for her boundaries. As a friend, he agreed. I'll come by in a week then, if that suits you. Katherine nodded, suddenly unable to trust her voice. Yates touched the brim of his hat in farewell and stepped out into the gathering darkness. True to his word, Yates returned the following week, and then the next, establishing a pattern that continued as autumn deepened toward winter. Sometimes he brought small gifts, coffee beans, a new book from the Mercantile, honey from the Simpsons' hives. Other times, he arrived with tools or materials to make improvements to the homestead, reinforcing the barn against winter storms, repairing the roof, building shelves for Katherine's growing collection of preserves. With each visit, the ease between them grew. Katherine found herself watching the trail from her window on the days Yates usually came, her heart lifting at the sight of his familiar figure approaching on horseback. They settled into comfortable routines, working together on projects around the homestead, sharing meals, talking long into the evening before Yates would reluctantly depart. As November brought the first dusting of snow to the higher elevations, Katherine realized with startling clarity that she had come to depend on these visits, to look forward to them with an anticipation that went beyond mere friendship. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. One evening, as they sat before the fire after supper, Yates mentioned casually that Harold Simpson had offered to sell him a small parcel of land adjacent to the northern pastures. "It's good grazing land with a year-round spring," he explained, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "Has a basic cabin already built, nothing fancy but solid." "Are you considering it?" Katherine asked, her heart beating a strange rhythm. Yates nodded slowly. "Been saving for something like this for years, never found the right place before." "What's different now?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning. Yates turned to look at her directly, his gaze steady and clear. "I think you know, Katherine." She did know, had perhaps known for weeks. But hearing him acknowledge it so plainly sent heat rushing to her cheeks. "Yates, You don't need to say anything," he interrupted gently. "I know it's still soon for you. I just wanted you to understand why I might be putting down roots here." Katherine stared into the fire, emotions warring within her. Grief for Eliza, still raw despite the passing months. Loyalty to Thomas, though their marriage had been more partnership than passion. And something new, something growing between her and this quiet, steadfast man who had appeared in her darkest hour and remained a constant presence ever since. "I care for you," she said finally, the words barely audible. "More than I expected to care for anyone again, but I'm afraid." "Of what?" Yates asked, his voice equally soft. "Of losing again. Of feeling this way and having it torn away." She looked up at him, vulnerability naked in her expression. "I couldn't bear it a second time." Yates moved from his chair to kneel beside her, taking her hands in his. His touch was warm and steady, like everything about him. "Katherine, none of us knows what tomorrow brings. That's the lesson grief teaches, harsh as it is. But should we refuse joy today because of fear of tomorrow's pain?" Tears gathered in Katherine's eyes. "It feels disloyal somehow, to Eliza, to Thomas. Would Thomas want you to live the rest of your life alone?" She shook her head slowly. "No, he was practical that way. He'd want me to be taken care of." "And Eliza," Yates paused, choosing his words with care. "I never knew her, but I imagine she was like you, full of light and strength. Would a child who came from such love want her mother to deny herself happiness?" A tear slipped down Katherine's cheek. "No," she whispered. Yates reached up, gently brushing the tear away with his thumb. "I'm not asking for promises, Katherine. Just a chance. Time to see if what's growing between us might become something lasting." Katherine looked into his eyes, so full of genuine feeling, and felt something long frozen within her begin to thaw. She leaned forward, her decision made, and pressed her lips to his in a brief, tender kiss. When she drew back, Yates was watching her with wonder, as if she had given him something precious beyond words. "I'd like that chance," she said softly. "Time to see where this leads us." The first real winter storm arrived the following week. Blanketing the territory in heavy snow, that transformed the landscape into something alien and beautiful. Katherine watched from her window as the familiar contours of her homestead disappeared under the white drifts, wondering if Yates would be able to keep his promise to visit. By mid-afternoon, when there was still no sign of him, she resigned herself to solitude, stoking the fire against the growing cold. The sudden knock at her door startled her so badly she dropped the poker with a clatter. Yates stood on her porch, his coat and hat covered in snow, his cheeks red from the cold. "Thought I might not make it," he said, stamping his boots before entering at her invitation. "Simpson said I was crazy to try, but I promised I'd come." Relief and joy washed through Katherine. She helped him remove his snow-covered outer garments, noticing with concern that his hands were nearly frozen despite his gloves. "You shouldn't have risked it," she scolded, leading him to the fire and pressing a cup of hot coffee into his hands. "What if you gotten lost in the storm?" "Worth the risk," he replied simply, his eyes never leaving her face. That night, the storm intensified, making it impossible for Yates to return to the Simpson ranch. Katherine made a bed for him on the floor near the hearth, providing blankets and a pillow. It should have been awkward, this impromptu overnight arrangement, but somehow it felt natural, as if they had crossed some invisible boundary together. They talked late into the night, the howling wind outside making their small circle of firelight seem all the more intimate. Yates told stories of his childhood in Texas, of the mischief he and his brothers had found. Katherine shared memories of her parents, of the books that had shaped her thinking, of the dreams she still harbored. When they finally prepared to sleep, Yates stretched out on his makeshift bed while Katherine retired to her room. Through the partially open door, their conversation continued in softer tones, drifting into more personal territory as the night deepened around them. "Do you ever regret coming west?" Yates asked. Katherine considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, especially after Eliza. But then I think of what my life would have been in Boston, constrained, defined by Thomas's memory and society's expectations. Here, despite everything, I've found a kind of freedom I never knew before. And now?" His voice was careful, neutral. "With winter setting in? Now I'm glad I stayed," she replied honestly, "for many reasons." The storm lasted 3 days, during which Yates and Katherine established a domestic routine that felt surprisingly comfortable. He chopped wood and tended the animals, battling the snowdrifts to reach the barn twice daily. She cooked and mended, read aloud in the evenings, and taught Yates to play chess on the small set she'd brought from Boston. By the time the skies cleared, allowing Yates to finally return to the Simpson ranch, something fundamental had shifted between them. The forced proximity had accelerated the natural development of their relationship, revealing a compatibility that went beyond their initial connection through grief. Before leaving, Yates stood with Katherine at her door, reluctance evident in every line of his body. "I'll be back as soon as I can," he promised, "probably 3 days, depending on the trails." Katherine nodded, equally unwilling to see him go. "Be careful." Impulsively, she reached up and kissed him goodbye, not the brief, tentative kiss of their previous encounter, but something deeper, a promise of feelings that were rapidly moving beyond simple affection. When they separated, Yates touched her cheek gently. "I'll be counting the hours," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Winter settled over the territory in earnest, transforming daily life into a challenge of endurance and careful planning. The trails between homesteads often became impassable after storms, isolating families for days or weeks at a time. Despite these difficulties, Yates managed to visit Katherine regularly, sometimes staying for extended periods when weather made travel dangerous. Christmas approached, bringing with it memories that threatened to overwhelm Katherine. It would have been Eliza's first Christmas, a thought that pierced her heart anew each time it surfaced. Yates, sensing her melancholy, suggested they create their own small celebration. "Nothing elaborate," he said, "just something to mark the day in our own way." On Christmas Eve, he arrived with a small pine tree strapped to his saddle, not the traditional fir of Katherine's Eastern memories, but perfect in its scrappy resilience. Together they set it up in the corner of the cabin, decorating it with strips of colored cloth, dried berries, and paper stars Katherine crafted from pages of an old catalog. That evening, they exchanged simple gifts: a new hunting knife for Yates, wrapped in red cloth; for Katherine, a journal with a soft leather cover, perfect for the stories she'd begun to write during the long winter evenings. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the smooth surface. "Thank you." "I have something else for you," Yates said hesitantly, reaching into his pocket. "It's not exactly a Christmas gift, more of a question." He withdrew a small object and held it out to her, a simple silver ring with a single pearl nestled in the center. Katherine's breath caught in her throat. "It was my mother's," Yates explained, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "Not fancy, but she treasured it. Said the pearl represented something precious found in unlikely places." "Yates," Katherine whispered, understanding the significance of this offering. He took her hand gently. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer. I know it hasn't been that long since we met and you're still healing. But I want you to know my intentions. I love you, Katherine Lawson. I think I've loved you since that first night, watching you rock your daughter with such devotion. I'd be honored if someday you'd consider becoming my wife." Tears filled Katherine's eyes, not the bitter tears of grief that had been her constant companion for so long, but something sweeter, touched with hope and possibility. "This is unexpected," she managed, her voice unsteady. "Too soon?" Yates asked, concern replacing the hope in his expression. Katherine shook her head slowly. "Not too soon, just overwhelming, in the best possible way." She looked down at the ring, then back at his face. "I need a little time. Not because I don't care for you, I do, deeply. But marriage is not something I can enter into lightly, especially after—" "I understand," Yates interrupted gently. "Take all the time you need. The ring is yours, regardless, a promise from me to you, without expectations attached." Katherine accepted the ring, holding it carefully in her palm. "Will you put it on for me? Not as an acceptance, but as acknowledgement of your promise and my consideration of it." Yates smiled, taking the ring and sliding it onto the third finger of her right hand, not the traditional placement for an engagement, but a symbolic middle ground that suited their current understanding. The pearl gleamed softly in the firelight, catching reflections of the colored cloth decorating their small Christmas tree. That night, before Yates retired to the pallet he now regularly used when staying at the homestead, Katherine kissed him with new confidence, allowing herself to explore the depth of her feelings without reservation. His response was equally passionate but restrained, respecting the boundaries they had established. "Merry Christmas, Katherine," he murmured against her hair when they finally separated. "Merry Christmas, Yates," she replied, feeling for the first time that the sentiment might actually be possible. The new year arrived with bitter cold and heavy snow, forcing Yates to remain at the Simpson Ranch for nearly 2 weeks. When he finally made it back to Catherine's homestead, he found her busy with preparations for spring planting, poring over seed catalogs and sketching garden layouts. "I didn't realize how much I'd miss you," she admitted as they sat before the fire that evening. "The cabin feels empty without you now." Yates smiled, taking her hand and running his thumb over the pearl ring she still wore on her right hand. "I've been thinking about that. About us." "Oh?" Katherine raised an eyebrow, setting aside her mending. "Harold agreed to sell me that parcel we discussed. The papers will be ready next month." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "It's good land, Katherine. Room for cattle, horses, a proper garden, maybe even an orchard eventually." "It sounds wonderful," she said sincerely. "I'd like you to see it," Yates continued, "when the trail's clear enough for travel, before you make any decisions about us." Katherine studied him thoughtfully. In the month since Eliza's death, this man had become essential to her in ways she'd never anticipated. His steady presence, his quiet strength, his unwavering support, these had helped heal wounds she'd thought would never close. "You don't need to see the land to know how I feel about you," she said softly. "But I'd like to see it anyway, to imagine what might be possible there." Hope brightened Yates's eyes. "Does that mean—" Katherine moved from her chair to sit beside him, taking his face between her hands. "It means I love you, Yates Zachary. I think I have for quite some time. And yes, I will marry you, if the offer still stands." His answer came in the form of a kiss that spoke more eloquently than words, conveying all the longing and tenderness that had built between them over the winter months. When they finally parted, Yates reached for her hand. Gently removing the pearl ring from her right hand and placing it on the third finger of her left. "It stands," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion, "until the end of my days." As February gave way to March, the first signs of thaw appeared in the territory. Patches of brown earth emerged from beneath the snow, and the creek that ran behind Catherine's cabin began to flow freely again. With the improving weather came increased activity. Travelers on the trails, visits from neighbors long isolated by winter conditions, preparations for spring planting and calving season. Katherine and Yates made plans for a simple wedding in April to be held at the Simpson Ranch, with Harold presiding as justice of the peace. Eleanor took Katherine under her wing, helping her prepare a wedding dress from fabric ordered from the Mercantile in Copper Springs. "Nothing fancy," Katherine insisted. "Something practical I can wear again." Eleanor smiled knowingly. "Practical, yes, but still special. This is a celebration, my dear." As the wedding day approached, Katherine found herself visiting Eliza's grave more frequently, speaking softly to her daughter about the changes in her life, about Yates, about the future that was unfolding in ways she never could have imagined in those dark days after the fever took her child. "I'll always be your mother," she whispered one clear spring morning, placing a handful of the first wildflowers on the small grave. "Nothing will ever change that. But I think you would like him, my sweet girl. He has a good heart. And I believe he would have loved you as his own." The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Yates dismounted a respectful distance away, waiting until Katherine beckoned before joining her beside the grave. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said softly. Katherine shook her head. "You're not. I was just telling her about us." Yates knelt beside her, removing his hat. "Hello, Eliza," he said, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact, as if speaking to a child who could hear him. I wish I could have known you. Your mother tells me you had quite a grip and the most beautiful eyes. Catherine's heart swelled with love for this man who acknowledged her daughter so naturally, who understood that Eliza would always be part of her life, part of who she was. I promise to take care of your mother, Yates continued, to honor her strength and her heart, and to make sure she's never alone again when grief finds her. Tears blurred Catherine's vision, but they were healing tears, washing away the last remnants of the wall she'd built around her heart. She leaned against Yates, drawing comfort from his solid presence. Thank you, she whispered. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Family is family, Katherine. The ones we're born to, the ones we lose, the ones we choose. All part of the same circle. They remained by the grave a while longer, the spring sunshine warming their shoulders, the scent of earth and new growth filling the air around them. When they finally rose to leave, Katherine felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in almost a year, not the absence of grief, but its integration into a life that continued to unfold with unexpected richness. The wedding day dawned clear and mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of desert blooms. The Simpsons had transformed their ranch house for the occasion, with wildflowers in mason jars decorating every surface and ribbons festooning the porch railings. Neighbors from miles around gathered to witness the union, bringing food and gifts and music to celebrate the first wedding in the territory that spring. Katherine wore a simple dress of soft blue cotton with tiny pearl buttons that echoed the stone in her ring. Eleanor had helped her style her hair, weaving small white flowers into the dark strands. As she prepared in the Simpsons' guest room, Katherine felt a curious blend of nervousness and absolute certainty. A soft knock at the door preceded Eleanor's entrance. "It's time, my dear. Are you ready?" Katherine nodded, smoothing the fabric of her dress with suddenly trembling hands. "I never expected this," she admitted. "After Thomas died, after losing Eliza, I thought that chapter of my life was closed forever." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "Life has a way of surprising us, especially out here, where everything is always changing." Outside, Harold had arranged chairs in a semicircle facing the ranch house's wide front porch. Yates stood waiting, dressed in a new shirt and vest, his usual weathered hat replaced by one Katherine had never seen before. His face, when he caught sight of her walking toward him, transformed with joy so pure it took her breath away. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, with Harold speaking about the importance of partnership and resilience in the challenging Western Territory. When it came time for their vows, Yates took Katherine's hands in his voice clear and steady as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her through all the seasons of their life together. Katherine, looking up into his eyes, found the words she'd prepared momentarily forgotten. Instead, she spoke from her heart. "Yates Zachary, you came to me on the darkest night of my life and sat beside me until the sun rose. You helped me bury my child, and then you helped me find reasons to continue living. You never asked me to forget or to move on faster than I was able. Instead, you walked beside me, patient and constant, until I was ready to walk toward you." Her voice broke slightly, but she continued. "I promise to love you with the same patience and constancy, to build a life with you filled with honesty, respect, and joy, to face whatever comes good or difficult together. There wasn't a dry eye among the gathered witnesses as Harold pronounced them husband and wife. When Yates leaned down to kiss her, Katherine felt as if something long broken inside her had finally healed, not erasing the past, but creating space for a future she had once thought impossible. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing, storytelling and laughter. Katherine found herself surrounded by people who had become a community to her over the difficult year, neighbors who had checked on her during storms, brought supplies when needed, offered friendship when loneliness threatened to overwhelm her. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in gold and crimson, Yates found her sitting on the porch steps, taking a moment of quiet amidst the festivities. "Happy?" he asked, settling beside her. Katherine leaned against his shoulder, watching the spectacular sunset unfold before them. "Yes," she said simply. "In a way I didn't think possible again." "Good." He kissed the top of her head. "That's all I want." They remained there, side by side, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow they would begin their life together on the land Yates had purchased, building something new from the foundations of all they had experienced separately and together. The path ahead would not be easy. Life in the territory never was, but Katherine faced it without fear, confident in the strength they had found in each other. As night fell completely, Yates stood and offered her his hand. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Zachary?" Katherine took his hand, rising to stand beside him. "Home," she repeated, tasting the word and finding it sweet. "Yes, I'm ready." Together they walked toward the waiting wagon that would carry them to their new beginning, under the same vast desert sky where, less than a year before, a grieving mother and a kind cowboy had sat vigil through the longest night, waiting for the dawn.